Anxiety is a really blunt warning instrument. It goes off when there might be a problem, not just when there is a problem. And I like to think about anxiety as, do you remember when radar detectors first came out for your car? And everybody was really excited about radar detectors. And so everybody got one and they stuck it on their, dashboard. And what really happened was it drove people nuts because every time they would drive past a store that had the automatic doors, the radar detector would go off. The radar detector didn't know if it was a police officer with a speed gun or an automatic door. That's what anxiety is. It doesn't know if it's a real problem or not a real problem, but it's going to alert you no matter what.
Hello and welcome to MindShift, the podcast where we explore how to achieve a balanced, fulfilling life by changing the way we think. I'm Alina Bartuli, the creator of this podcast. Having lived in 5 countries and learned 5 languages, I've connected with people from diverse backgrounds. I found that fundamental human struggles and dreams are remarkably similar despite our differences. Let's explore these similarities and differences together as we navigate a path to a fulfilling, peaceful life in our ever-changing world. Hey, welcome to another episode of MindShift with Alina Bartuli. And today we have an incredibly insightful and dynamic guest joining us. Lindsey Carnick is a licensed psychotherapist, the owner and founder of Onward Psychological Services, and a speaker known for her interactive workshops that tackle stress management head-on. Lindsey's approach is a blend of clinical excellence, philosophical wisdom, humor, and a dash of irreverence, which I like. She is known for her real talk and relatable style. With over a decade of experience helping clients ranging from military officers and professional athletes to working moms and tech entrepreneurs, Lindsey has become a powerful advocate for rewriting the stories we tell ourselves. Her goal? To help people break free from limiting narratives that hold them back in life. We're thrilled to have you today on the show, Lindsey, and welcome back.
Thank you, Alina. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Let's get right into it. I'm so curious to ask you many questions. You've spent years working with people who are struggling with everything from anxiety and stress to feelings of guilt and shame. The title of one of your talks really caught my eye. It says, Stuffing versus Exploding. Where do your hard feelings go? And I have that question to myself also, and I'm sure our listeners too. So let's start there. Why do so many of us seem to swing between these two extremes? Is there a middle ground? And most importantly, how do we find it?
Well, my experience, certainly even in my own life, is that most of us end up stuffing things that we think are unacceptable. And either we think they're unacceptable to the external world, maybe we imagine that the people around us in our lives would find those feelings distasteful or unwarranted, or some other version of not okay, or we have value systems or beliefs about what feelings and experiences are okay or good or right, some sort of hierarchy here about right, wrong, good, and bad. And most of us end up stuffing, whether that's internally, meaning that we don't acknowledge to ourselves how we're feeling or what we're experiencing, or externally, right? We sort of mask from other people or minimize or hide what we're feeling or experiencing, and stuff because we don't find those feelings to be up to par according to some other set of criteria. And ultimately, the exploding part is sort of the game of whack-a-mole in the sense that the longer people tend to stuff those things, the more likely they are to pop up unbidden, unwarranted, and unwanted in other sort of conditions. And then you're sort of smashing at them in all these different parts of your life, but they just sort of equalize somewhere else.
Wow. So did I hear you right? Is that because of our belief that some things are bad, then we don't show, like some emotions are bad, then we don't show them and then we stuff them?
Yes. And don't even want to acknowledge when they exist in many cases, right? We have some pretty severe judgments about what feelings we should be feeling. The magic should word, right? What feelings should we be feeling? What feelings are justified in any given set of conditions? We tend to have a lot of built up mythology around what we think our feelings say about us. The expression that I hear all the time in my personal life and my professional life is, I shouldn't feel that way. I should feel this way, right? Or if I feel that way, that means that I am something undesirable, right? The big one that usually comes up is, if I have that feeling, that makes me selfish. Or if I have that feeling, it makes me petty. All these really judgmental mythologies about what it means to feel something. And what becomes so explosive for a lot of people is that regardless of whether we have a judgment about those feelings, the feelings are there. And having a judgment about it makes us feel worse, because now most of us feel bad about feeling bad, right? We've heaped a sort of like moral dimension on top of an already sort of like unwanted experience of feeling badly. And often the explosion comes when people hit sort of this critical mass of feeling bad about feeling bad. It's not even the original feeling anymore that's sort of boiling up to the surface. It's this frustration and desire to not have the feeling because we think it says something negative about who we are or what our values are or what our values aren't.
It's probably important to distinguish between feeling and emotion, which is okay, no matter what the emotion is, because there's no such thing as bad or good emotion, versus how do you express it, right? So in my case, for example, I'm afraid to explode and yell, for example, or something like I would have some unaccessible in society behavior, right? And so I stuff because maybe I didn't learn how to express those emotions in a more verbal way, right? So what would be your recommendation in this case?
That's so interesting that you say that, because relatedly, and I just want to point this out, often we also have, when we have judgments about feelings and judgments about certain expressions of certain feelings, we also tend to misread our own reactions. So I'm not saying this is the case for you. I wouldn't know. Maybe you could weigh in here. But often if we have been sort of socialized in whatever context that is, like our immediate family, a culture, a society, a community, to think that something is unacceptable, we overestimate how much we're doing it. So my first question to you would be, in that scenario, are you really yelling? Because I bet a lot of the times you're not actually yelling or exploding. It just, by comparison to what somebody said was okay or not okay, or the judgment you have about that, seems like yelling, right? Often we very much overestimate the degree to which we're sort of doing this thing we're not supposed to be doing.
Oh, wow. This is a really good insight because, I just started podcasting. This is my third episode with the guest. And my first episode, my brain was like going into this fight or flight mode because I'm not familiar with the recording software. This is my first time doing it. And so my brain was kind of like, whoa. And I somehow perceived the beginning of conversation, because it was unfamiliar territory for me, as though, or some part of it as though I showed aggression or something, and then I looked at the recording, and I'm like, I don't see it. Why did I think I showed it?
Yeah.
It was perfectly normal conversation, but I
Yes.
somehow perceived something like apparently I have those internal critical judgment of how I do. Maybe I'm too aggressive or yelling, but actually I'm not. Most of the time I'm stuffing.
And so we're really very, I would call it, hyper-vigilant and overly vigilant for those things that we have deemed not good, right? So you're much more likely to say to yourself, oh my gosh, I was so aggressive, or I was so loud or yelly or shouty, or whatever the things are you think are to be avoided, right? And then you go back in retrospect and you listen to the podcast and you go, oh my gosh, that's a normal conversational tone. It could not be less unremarkable. And yet at the time, it feels so big and so out of control.
Exactly.
It's really remarkable.
I wish all of us recorded ourselves.
Isn't
and
that
just to see how we look from the outsider perspective sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've also spoken about how our brains sometimes deceive us, especially when it comes to overthinking. And you just mentioned slightly about like overjudging and overthinking. You even have a workshop called Your Brain Wants You to Believe Thinking is the Answer. It's lying to you. Can you explain what it means? What do you mean by this, and how overthinking can be a trap for many people?
Well, my favorite working psychologist, his name is Chad Lejeune. And he has this wonderful sort of, well, I'm going to quote it. I'm going to make it into a quote. where he says, if you're not making a plan, you're not planning. And if you're not finding solutions, you're not problem solving. You're just worrying, right? Neither of those things are intrinsic to worrying, right? If you're not producing either of those results. And, so thinking is such a remarkably successful strategy for us so much of the time. We go through our days making bazillions of little micro decisions that have big impact, small impact, bigger impact in the aggregate, any one of a number of things. We're just sold on thinking as the end all be all. And you'll notice that even in our sort of popular parlance, we'll say things like when something doesn't work out or doesn't go quite right, we'll say things like, oh, I didn't really think it through all the way. Or, oh, I sort of didn't think about that the right way. As if thinking itself is infallible. And if you just do it right, then you will always get to the correct outcome or the right answer. And what we know is that at some point we are just spinning our wheels, as Chad Lejeune points out. I like to call it the dreadmill because it's just like a treadmill. You're covering territory, but you're not going anywhere, right? You're covering the same territory again and again and again. And you get to the end and you're exhausted and wiped out, and yet you haven't gone anywhere. And we will double down on thinking any day of the week and choose to stay on the treadmill with this sort of like built-in assumption that if we just stay there long enough, we're gonna find a thing, the answer, the solution, the fix, the solve. And often that's not true. You and I could both think of probably half dozen examples from the last 36 hours in which we bumped into something that did not have a solution. Like literally does not have a solution in this moment. It doesn't matter if you think about it for a long time or 2 seconds. There's no solution in this moment. And yet, because evolutionarily speaking, we've been very successful by thinking, our brains just keep going like a wood chipper or a treadmill. They do not notice or care if we're getting anywhere with it. It's just what they do. They think and they think and they think. And so part of, I think, our task is to recognize that like a wood chipper, the brain will just keep thinking. Even when there's nothing to feed into it, nothing coming out, it'll just keep going. And that there are other strategies that will serve us more successfully in feeling better, which is what we associate with solving problems. We get fixated on, in order to feel better, I have to find the answer. When in fact, you do not have to find the answer. You do not have to find resolution, because then you're a hostage, right? You're a hostage to a resolution. Instead of saying, you know what? I don't know when that's going to get answered, but I can feel better in the now regardless. I'm not going to stay sort of a hostage to getting that fixed or solved in order to feel better, because there's always another one of those around the corner, right? Like if we're dependent on things being solved or fixed or resolved, we're going to be miserable forever.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a really good insight, because I feel like at our work, in our lives in general, we always have some sort of problems that we need to solve, or sometimes don't need to solve. There's just something that is not under our control, right? So I feel like if we are constantly in that treadmill of solving that problem, we're basically wasting our resources there.
Yes.
Our energy.
And I just wanted to add, think about how often we use the expression or hear the expression, oh, as soon as that thing is over with, then I'll relax. Or as soon as I get that thing handled, then I can, take a break. There's always another thing, right? There's never going to be a state in which there's not something that is unresolved. So if we're making our sense of okayness dependent on everything being tied up with a bow at all times, we're totally hosed.
Yes. Wow. That's really important to remind ourselves, like on a daily basis, because I definitely tend to go on a treadmill.
I mean, we all do. It's the way we're wired. Right?
Yeah.
We did not get to be the dominant species on the planet by thinking things were going to turn out well. We got to be the dominant species on the planet by worrying that every sound behind every bush and rock was about to eat us, right? We are wired to sort of worry. That's how we've done what we've done. Yay, humans, here we are. And yet,
yes, I'm Just reminded me that I'm watching The Lost, this old TV show that's my guilty pleasure. How people constantly are in the situations where they have to literally survive. Literally, there's a bush rustling and some danger is coming out, and a lot of times our brain is like still like in that ancient survival mode, dealing with the bush, rustling bush.
Sometimes we forget that most of what I like to call the hardware is the original hardware. Very little of it has been updated, right? And we're trying to run this updated software on this old hardware, and sometimes it really causes some tension because the body, this is another thing that Chad Lejeune talks about a lot. Anxiety is a really blunt warning instrument, okay? It goes off when there might be a problem, not just when there is a problem. I like to think about anxiety as, you remember when radar detectors first came out for your car? And everybody was really excited about radar detectors because they thought they'd get fewer speeding tickets. And so everybody got one and they stuck it on their, dashboard. And what really happened was it drove people nuts because every time they would drive past a store that had the automatic doors, the radar detector would go off. The radar detector didn't know if it was a police officer with a speed gun or an automatic door. That's what anxiety is. It doesn't know if it's a real problem or not a real problem, but it's going to alert you no matter what. And again, humans got to be where they are by sort of going at every possible alert and erring on the side of caution. That's when we were sort of, I don't want to say more aware of survival because it's not a thing to be aware of or not. But now we have sort of this awareness of the awareness and a self-awareness about our own reactions. And now we can go, oh, well, I am surviving. And also that radar detector is making me miserable and I want to rip it off the dashboard because it's beeping at every Safeway and King Soopers I drive by. And that's making me nuts. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about quality of life. That's where we've sort of gotten sidetracked.
Exactly. Yes. I definitely changed my values recently to pay attention to the quality of life. Quality of life is very important for me. So I try to deal with my kind of background anxiety slowly. It's a process. Some days are better, some days are worse. But definitely I'm trying to concentrate my mind on the new goal. The new mission is to build a good quality life. It's not to be worried about everything every moment and you just try to solve something unsolvable. And worrying is not like sometimes people say, it's because I care. No, worrying is not caring. I think caring is more productive, if you care, you just, but worrying is more like, for me, it's draining energy.
It is draining. I mean, it is literally a draw on your physiological system because worry and anxiety have very real physiological components, right? Mm-hmm. So it is an absolute energy drain in the realest sense of the tangible word.
Do you have any tips how to recognize if a person has an anxiety? Like sometimes it's hard to recognize, right, when you're in that state.
Could you say more? Like has an anxiety versus
well, you just mentioned stress, right? Like, or stress or versus anxiety. Like, how can I distinguish? Or maybe anxiety versus just normal life. Some people, like me included, I used to be in a constant state of anxiety. So for me, it's difficult to know that it's not normal. That's not the way to live life, Yeah. Because sometimes, like, if you're in this state for many, many days and many months, and then it comes into years, you just can't distinguish anymore that you're anxious because it's your normal state.
It's become your baseline. Yes.
Baseline. So how for people like that, for whom anxiety became a baseline, how can they distinguish that they're constantly anxious and how can they deal with it?
That is such an interesting question because we could observe that there are a lot of things going on in the world that are very anxiety provoking constantly, right?
Exactly.
Well, one could sort of easily say, well, it's not that I'm anxious. It's that there's constantly things in the environment that are understandably sort of cueing a stress response, right? I mean, anxiety is essentially prolonged stress response after the stressor has been sort of terminated. But there's always another one, right? Depending on how what you're inundated with and what you expose yourself to and what you are exposed to. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. How do we differentiate anxiety maybe as a condition from saying, no, this is an anxious, it's anxious being a human, right? It's being alive is a sort of an anxious experience. There is inherent risk in being alive, and anxiety is fundamentally a risk warning light, right? So in a way, I mean, anxiety is not abnormal in the sense that it is the body's warning signal, again, that there might be something threatening or dangerous or potentially harmful. The one of the distinctions I would make is when anxiety has become a warning sign, or it ceases to be a warning sign that something might be amiss, and instead seems like a tried and true, for sure indicator that something is amiss. That's a difference, right? Does it cue us to go, oh, is there a problem? Or does it cue us to go, there's a problem? Have we mistaken the warning light for a threat? Right? Because a little red light on your dashboard that says like, oh, warning, your car might need service. Keyword, might need service. Please take it to the dealership or your mechanic and have them look. It doesn't mean there is a problem. And one of the sort of complications that I think we face as humans is mistaking the warning light for a problem. We go, I feel anxious, ergo there is something to be anxious about. No, not necessarily. It's just an indicator that maybe you should open your eyes and look around, take your car to the dealership, right? So starting to differentiate between the feeling and the actuality of a threat is a sort of really helpful way to, I think, parse through what kind of sort of stress response we're having. Is it stress? Is it a prolonged anxiety? Do I feel all the time that something is wrong, even when things aren't wrong? Do I feel that my body is in a sort of state of being threatened, even when I'm not being threatened, so to speak? Those are ways to start to look at and maybe understand the differences between stress and anxiety and sort of an acute, understandable stress response to a stressor versus a chronic state of anxiety.
Interesting. Thank you so much for this
insight.
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the things you specialize in is helping people manage anger and resentment. Yes, these are such powerful emotions, and I know many people struggle with feeling like they can't control their reactions. What advice do you give to your clients who are tired of losing it, or people but losing it on people, but also don't want to suppress their feelings?
Yes. Well, the more you suppress your feelings, almost the more you're guaranteed to lose it on someone else, right? Because that is the same as sort of like having a steaming pot and trying to hold the lid on while the heat's still on and generating more steam. Eventually, the steam's going to build up, right? It almost guarantees it. So I don't want to oversimplify what it means to effectively cope with the feelings that underpin anger outbursts. And I'm sorry, there was a second part to your question, but I'll start with that one, with the anger outbursts. What I would recommend to people who experience extreme anger outbursts is a couple of things. One is that they get professional help, because anger is not about anger. Anger is about some other feeling that doesn't feel safe, that comes out as anger. That's almost predictably the case. I don't want to say 100% of the time, but frequently anger feels safe to people because even though there may be negative consequences, it feels strong, it feels powerful, it feels secure, it feels like nobody's going to get the better of you. It is the opposite of the feelings that usually create it. So many people experience anger because it feels safer than the feelings they're actually experiencing.
Right. I think I know what you mean. I've been in a personal therapy too. I had been in the past. And so, yeah, I did learn that anger is a secondary emotion that covers up the primary emotion. And the primary emotion is usually something more vulnerable, and that makes us feel even the energy level. When you feel anger, you feel more energy, right? But when you feel sad, for example, you feel less energy, you feel weak.
Yes.
almost not healthy.
Yeah. Yes.
For me, feeling that way is not for anybody. It's not pleasant. So I guess that's why it's easier to be angry.
Yes. And what people can learn in in a therapeutic setting or an anger management sort of setting, there are a couple different ways to go and sort of get that help and that training. Anger management classes, anger management workbooks, is people start to learn to sort of identify the feelings that are underneath the anger and then work more effectively with those feelings, because stuffing should never be the option. It's not a successful option. Right? We can teach people other coping strategies so that they don't, if they feel like they're really going to have sort of an anger outburst, that we're not having consequences on other people, that we're not causing pain or, inflicting damage on relationships, right? And as we're doing that, we teach people skills to really work more effectively with those primary feelings, and none of that ever involves stuffing. One of the ways of thinking about dealing with outbursts that I think a lot of feelings, but including outbursts, is the ACT model. And the ACT model is very powerful because it helps people recognize and accept the feeling they're having, whatever feeling that is, and then act in accordance with their values, which most adults have a lot of practice at, but don't give themselves any credit for. So people will say things like, I just couldn't help snapping off at that person because I was so frustrated, or I was so, whatever it was they were feeling. And you go, I can understand that. I mean, clearly you're frustrated, etc. And ironically, we could also name a half dozen times in the last 24 hours when you had a feeling and yet that did not dictate your actions. You had the feeling and yet you acted in accordance with your value. The example I love to give is this. Most parents of young children still in diapers will not leave their children in a dirty diaper. If the kid starts yelling in the middle of the night, crying, needs to be changed, they get up and they go change their baby. Now, at 2 a.m., when it's cold and you're sleeping soundly, no one feels like getting out of bed and changing a diaper, no matter how much you love your baby. That's not in question. It's just not a great experience, right?
Right.
Nobody feels like getting out of bed at 2 a.m., putting their feet on the cold floor, hoofing it down the hall and changing a diaper. But people do it for years and years and years and years and years, repeatedly, happily, because their value is, I don't leave my baby in a dirty diaper. Their value is so much more important than their temporary feeling of, I don't want to get out of bed in the morning. And so the ACT model, for people who are maybe interested in seeking out an ACT practitioner, ACT therapists who are wonderful, the ACT model is really powerful for helping people sort of, on the one hand, recognize and accept the feeling, golly, I really don't feel like changing this diaper right now, for example. I'm tired, I'm, all these things. And I'm going to act on my value, which is to take good care of my child or my baby, right? And the interesting thing is that values are really reliable. Our values really don't fluctuate. Whereas our feelings zing in and out like the breeze, right? Zing, 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 all over the place. And we know that because often when we act on our feelings, like if you were to not change the diaper, you would then feel profound regret the next morning. Your feeling would change, but your value would not have changed at all, right? So whereas in the middle of the night, you might not feel like it, the next morning you'll feel guilty and regretful and bad and many other things if you were to sort of do that. So I love ACT for folks who are working on sort of anger management type, pathways, because it really helps people hold and honor the feelings that they're having. It is the opposite of asking people to stuff their feelings, and also helping clarify for people the values that they hold, that they want to act on, because your feelings and your values do not have to be in alignment. I have never met an adult who woke up on April 15th and was like, I feel like paying taxes today. Nobody feels like that. And yet everybody does. I don't know if everybody does. Many people do, right?
Okay.
They don't feel like it. And we could think of a million examples of this. I mean, much of adult life is about having some feelings about something and then acting on your value. And those values have nothing to do with your feelings about it, right? It irritates you and you're going to do it. It annoys you and you're going to do it. It outright angers you and you're going to do it. Whatever the case may be, that's okay.
Okay, so let's talk about another important thing I think will be useful for many listeners. So motivation. Yes. You've been open about the fact that motivation isn't some magical force that just shows up when we need it. What's the secret to having more motivation, especially when life feels like overwhelming? And what's the difference between motivation and inner pressure? That's my curiosity.
I can certainly only speak from my perspective. And there are many people who study motivation, right, intensively in athletes and work with athletes, and lots of people whose whole world is motivation, right? So having said that, I think an interesting thing that most people experience when it comes to motivation is that we sort of treat motivation like it's this secret sauce that some people have and some people don't. And those of us who don't have it wish we could get more of it. Like, where do I find that on Amazon? Can I get a 40-gallon drum of motivation? How did that person get all stocked up on motivation and they ran out the store, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's helpful to not think about motivation as a secret sauce or even necessary. I'm not sure motivation is necessary. And this a little gets back to what we were talking about a minute ago with, do you need your feelings to align with your values in order to act on your values? And the answer is no. You just need some kind of reason. Some kind of reason, right? And motivation usually, in the way people sort of talk about it, has sort of this mystique and this aura. And not only is it a secret sauce, there's like this good person quality, like you're a motivated person and that means something really good about you and you're doing it for the right reasons, whatever it is. And I think that's really demoralizing to people when they don't have it, right? Because then it must mean the opposite. Okay, well, if good, successful people have it and I don't have it, that must mean I'm what? Not a good, successful person? Like, where are we going with this? And I don't buy into that, quite frankly. What I buy into is that motivation is overrated and that there are lots of other what I would call levers that we can sort of pull on to get things done when we don't feel like it. So one of the things I like to talk about that I think is gravely underrated is literally leverage. How can you, knowing what you know about yourself, leverage yourself to get yourself to do something that you know, quite frankly, when the time comes, you won't want to do? I think exercise is a tremendous example, and we can think of the oldest exercise recommendation in the book, which is if you're having a hard time getting to the gym, get a buddy, get a workout buddy. And the reason that works is because it leverages our innate sense of accountability and not wanting to disappoint someone else, which is much stronger usually than our sense of not wanting to disappoint ourselves. Yeah? That's leverage. Now, maybe some people might say, and understandably so, that we're sort of nitpicking vocabulary here about the difference between leverage and motivation and, incentivizing. Sure, that could be true. But to me, leverage is a much less mystical, ethereal idea, right? Instead of saying, like, I just wish I had this magic feeling that sort of animated my actions. We're saying, you know what? I know that if I tell Bob I'm going to meet him at the gym at 9 a.m. and then I don't show, I'm going to feel like a real rat. That's how I'm going to leverage myself, right? Yeah. Or many of us, we're sort of like strangely competitive with ourselves, or we're strangely accountable in these sort of like unspoken ways. For example, many people find that if they just say out loud, if they make a commitment out loud to someone else in their life, not that that person has to care or not care about the thing, but if they say, just so you know, I'm going to the gym on Monday and Wednesday, once they've said it out loud to that person, they feel obligated just to carry it out, to follow through. They don't want to report back that they didn't do the thing. Mm-hmm. That's leverage. That's leveraging what you know about wanting to follow through on your word, right? And if it gets it done, there's not a thing in the world wrong with that. It's absolutely as good as motivation. And it can change over time, as does motivation, right? People's reasons for doing things absolutely evolve over time. That's natural and normal. And I think as any one of us evolve, we're sort of, wise to continually reevaluate what motivates us and what leverages us because we're changing. And so the things, that I bet motivated you and I when we were 13 are now what motivate us now. It's highly unlikely, right? Most people are the same way.
I really like this practical advice because that helped in my life. For instance, I had a clinical depression just recently for like a couple years. And I knew that it's important for me to start exercising, to get out of that. Well, it was a systemic approach. There was a lot of things I had to do, but I didn't have energy to do so. I barely had energy to stand up from my bed. So what I did, I hired a personal trainer who came to my house, knocked my door, and I literally cannot say no.
Yes.
Because the person made all the way.
Yes.
And no matter how I feel, I just went there, just
That's such a great example. That's such a great example. You set it up, you structured it to operationalize leverage on yourself. And that's really important. I'm glad you said that because structure is so much more important than motivation. So much more important than motivation. The personal trainer example is a wonderful one. I know people who have leveraged that in different ways. I know somebody third hand who was training for an event, a big event, and was worried that she wouldn't be consistent. And so basically she signed a contract that she drew up with her coach that said, if I cancel or miss a workout, I will pay you $1,000 every single time. Yes. And the coach was like, I don't know how to feel about this, right? Like, I'm supposed to be invested in your success, not your failure. And yet you just made it really attractive for you not to come to practice. Right. But she knew that she absolutely was not going to spend did not have $1,000 burning a hole in her pocket one time, let alone, a dozen times. And she knew that would animate her. Or people who, to your point, pay ahead of time for a service, knowing that if they've paid for it, they are absolutely going to use it, right? Whereas if it's a pay-as-you-go kind of a basis, it doesn't hurt. There's no leverage. There's no incentive.
I like it.
Yeah. This is actually called behavioral activation. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but behavioral activation, which sort of speaks to this truth that if you sit around waiting to feel like doing something, it's likely never going to happen. If you can find some other way, structure, leverage, incentive, if you can find some other way to get yourself to do the thing, and the feelings of wanting to do the thing will follow.
That's right. Yeah, because in the process of going to gym, I really started enjoying the process, and I started enjoying the results that came really fast, faster than I expected.
Yes.
So I was like, whoa, that's really good for me. So I was more motivated. The motivation came in process, let's just say.
Yes. And I think because we put such a strange sort of cachet on motivation, it leads people to get hyper-focused on whether they do or don't have any.
Right.
And that leads them to focus more on getting motivation than getting the thing done.
Right. Wow, that's a good one. Yeah. There is no methodology that I know of that teaches you how to develop motivation. I don't know about such thing. It probably doesn't exist. So
there is a great book called Grit.
Uh-huh.
And Grit is, it's about grit, not motivation, but there's some overlap.
What is the title of the book?
Grit.
Literally great. Okay.
Grit. Yes, the author's name escapes me at the moment. It's a wonderful book.
Okay. Thank you for the recommendation. Lindsey, you have worked with a huge range of clients, from incarcerated juveniles to C-suite executives. Is there a common thread you see in all these different groups when it comes to how they deal with emotional challenges or stress?
What I would like to say about the common thread is that most people don't feel good enough. And that is what underpins most people's emotional distress.
Oh. Is it self-esteem?
Yes, I think we could call that self-esteem. We could also maybe call it a world full of moving targets about what it means to be good enough, and all these very confusing external messages from our micro communities and macro communities about what it means to be good enough, what it means to achieve, what it means to be successful relative to your peers versus relative to whomever.
So comparing yourself to others, right? And other people's success
Yes. And you're certainly your own internalized storyline about what success looks like or should look like or how you should be or ought to be.
Interesting. So, well, not comparing ourselves to others. It's easy to say, easier said than done. I don't know why we do that. Why do we compete like that? It's because basically, when you compare yourself to some other person, you're competing against that person. Like, right? In some, I don't know, quantitative stuff, maybe he has so many cars, I have that many cars. I don't know, or that salary, and I have this salary. Um, and maybe qualitative too. I don't know.
I think that's true. I think the human, we are herd animals, and there's nothing scarier to us on sort of a primordial level than being excluded from the herd or being the weak one in the herd or being left out or left behind. And so our comparative behavior is, I think, in essence, an attempt to reassure ourselves that we're not at the bottom. Because if you're at the bottom, you might be left out or left behind. And that's a very frightening proposition for a herd animal, which we are essentially. And I think you see that kind of comparative behavior and reassurance seeking or self-assuring that I'm not at the bottom. I don't know where I am, but at least I'm not at the bottom. I'm not going to be the one to be put out on the ice floe first or whatever. That's sort of like deep cellular level fear is.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I didn't know that it has connection to this kind of like primary survival instincts.
Well, I would feel comfortable saying most things do. Yeah, most things are sort of modern contemporary manifestations of very old things, right? Like as old as we are things, not as you and I, as humans are.
Right. Wow, that's just blowing my mind.
Yes, if that's interesting, for folks who are interested in that, psychobiology is a field of study that is primarily interested in the interplay between biology and psychology, and how one of the aspects of that is how does that original hardware, right, that original critterness, mix and inform what we think of as our sort of contemporary psychology or our mental experiences. Very interesting stuff.
Thank you. I'll definitely check it out. I'm curious.
Really neat field of study. Really neat field of study for people who are interested in learning more and participating or being exposed to conversations that are happening, right, about these links between our biology and our psychology.
Something you've spoken about is also the idea of living out a storyline you didn't choose. And that really spoke to me. I think it will also be helpful for our listeners to hear if you could elaborate on how people can start to identify and rewrite these unhelpful stories about themselves that they probably tell themselves.
It's so interesting to me because I think for most people, we have an awareness of a couple of those storylines, and we're very good at articulating them, right? Because in some ways, psychology has become such a pop interest, right? Most people have spent some time reflecting, like, oh, I wonder how my family of origin, I can see how that reflects on this part of my life, right? Or I can see how this person who is very influential sort of created a storyline for me about who I am or who I was supposed to be or what's important, right? Most people have some interest and awareness of that. And I would really encourage us all to think about being open to the idea that there are sort of, if we want to talk in storyline language, subplots that most of us are not identifying because they're not obvious, right? And that those subplots frame our ways of looking at the world and frame how we perceive information that's coming into us. And one of the things I think is most interesting about those storylines is that often we sort of make the assumption that because we are no longer in a situation or a setting or with a certain person, that all is null and void. And for many of us, parts of those experiences come with us into the present and inform the way we see things in ways that are very, very profound and also very nuanced and hard to identify. And it comes out in the way we make judgments about ourselves and other people, the way we have default beliefs about what's going on around us or about other people's motivations or intentions, how we, our sort of interpretive frameworks are very much informed by those storylines. One of the things that I like to encourage people to do is draw themselves a little picture, and we draw a line, a horizontal line that represents a bookshelf. And then you can see, just like on my bookshelf behind me, we draw a bunch of vertical little like spines of a book. Yes. And then I encourage people to come up with titles for each one of those storylines about who I am, what my life is about. And most people, if you give them, I think it's something we could all do over time. You could keep a singular journal and just keep adding to that when you notice a storyline you have, whether it's a big storyline or a little storyline or an old storyline or a new storyline, it doesn't matter. You sort of keep a collection of these titles. And when you see them on paper, when you've written them out or typed them out or something other than in your mind, you can start to be a little more critically analytical about them and say, did I write that story? Is that somebody else? Have I heard that before? Is that somebody else's storyline? Did I pick that up off somebody else's shelf? Did somebody force that on my shelf? Where did that storyline come from? Is it true? Or to use Byron Katie's words, is it a belief that I don't even believe, but that I continue to hold? And many of us have storylines that are based on beliefs that we don't believe, but that we're having a hard time letting go of nonetheless. I think being curious and open to the idea that it's a lifetime journey to unearth all of our storylines, and that's supposed to be an ongoing process. It's not something you're supposed to go to therapy, do 6 months and be like, check that box, storylines identified, donezo, good to go, right? I think it's a wonderfully generative process that can unfold as long as we're willing to give it.
Wow. So what could be the storylines we tell ourselves is about ourselves, right? About our past events, or how does it look like?
And about others and about the external world. Sure. We have stories about everything.
Interesting. And what can affect that framework of perception of those storylines? Any triggers from childhood or trauma, or
certainly developmental events, trauma histories, certainly, but also less maybe obvious things. Sometimes those are very subtle cultural influences, right? And cultural meaning small c, any culture that you're involved in, right? Like that could be nuclear family culture or an ethnic culture or religious culture, any culture, social culture, neighborhood culture, regional culture. Those are often very subtle. And often we can point to them without really also understanding how deeply they influence us, right? Which is a little bit of a red herring, because we sort of go like, oh, I'm aware of that. I can articulate that. I make jokes about that. Of course it doesn't influence me. And it does. The fact that you can crack jokes about it doesn't mean it's not influencing you.
Wow. Yeah. Our internal world is just so complicated. I'm just thinking.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It's fascinating at the same time. Yes, definitely. And it really spoke to me when you said that you can just check it out and I've done it. Hey, I went to therapy because when I started my therapy in the past, I was like that. I was like, okay, how many years or months I need to go into this thing to be okay? Finally.
You're counting down the sessions from 50, going to, Well, and I think, therapy is an interesting, all things that are therapeutic are not therapy, and all therapy is not therapeutic. And people can do very good work and grow personally outside of therapy, right? That's not the only environment in which that can take place, for sure. And I think maybe for some people, there's a little bit of a sense of I have to be able to say I'm done with therapy so that I can say I'm good. And there's this, they tie the two together, right? And until I can say I'm done with that, then I can't say I'm good or some iteration of that, right? And I think we're selling ourselves short by taking that position, in the sense that A, being in or out of therapy or some sort of treatment should not, dictate how you feel about how your internal world is evolving. I mean, that's a tool, right? And tools are meant to be picked up and used and set back down, and picked up and used and set back down. And they're meant to evolve as we evolve, right? And I think sometimes people get a little antsy to sort of say, like, I'm good, so I'm done with therapy, so I'm done with growth, right? Like, I just want to be good. And I get that. I really, really get that. And I think in some ways that's selling ourselves short, because hopefully we're all going to continue to evolve, right? And grow and change. And as we grow and change, we're going to have different awarenesses about all kinds of things, right? And we're going to have different interactions with the world around us. And that's going to inform what comes up for us. And so having a willingness to be like, oh, wow, didn't see that coming, but I'm going to look at that. That's super interesting, as opposed to be like, no, I was finished with therapy in 2016. Donezo, right? Not going back.
Right. It's just some kind of flaw in our logic, right? Like, going to therapy means something is not okay with me. Like, I'm not
something's wrong.
Once again, something is wrong, right?
Yes, and we want to be able to reassure ourselves and everybody else that nothing's wrong, right? Like, we don't like the idea of participating in an activity that maybe suggests that we're like not fine at all times.
Oh, goodness. Oh, so much pressure.
Yes. But it would also, I think, be the flip side is, it strikes me as a tremendous amount of pressure to sort of put oneself in this trajectory that says, like, well, I'm going to do X amount of this activity and be good for the rest of my life. I mean, we wouldn't say that about anything else, right? We wouldn't say, like, well, if you've been to the gym 50 times, then you're good for the rest of your life. And I mean, it's an understandable, I think, I'll go ahead and loosely use the word stigma, because we sort of, like, treat therapy as something that people go to when there's something wrong, right? People don't usually seek out therapy when there's something right. But we can also view therapy or any sort of like growth-oriented activity as a growth-oriented activity.
Right.
Not as a sign that something needs to be repaired.
Right. Maybe it's a maintenance.
100%. I think that's a great way to look at it.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you about something a bit lighter.
Yes.
Even though you made this really difficult topic sound kind of cool and light and funny, even funny. It was a blast. It was a blast.
Wonderful. Oh, it's so great to be here.
Yeah, I heard that you have a unique talent for eating dry cereal at remarkable rates. Can you share a bit about your hidden superpower?
I can. True story. I really love dry cereal. I've always really loved it. I also love cereal with milk. For those who are curious, it's not exclusively dry cereal. My favorite road trip food is a box of frosted shredded mini wheat. And left to my own devices, I will buy a family-size box and I will take it down by myself between point A and point B. And that is not an overnight drive either. I really love those things. This is a plug, actually, for frosted shredded mini wheats, which are just so, I don't know. I didn't have them as a kid. I don't know what my fixation is, but they're the perfect road trip food. I also, here's a pro tip. If you eat all the biscuits, they call them biscuits. The individual ones are called biscuits. I actually learned this fairly late. I was shocked. I just called it a single wheat. If you eat all the biscuits out, right, and then there's the bag, the cereal bag inside the box. At the bottom of the bag is about a 2.5-inch thing of what I call mini wheat dust. And it is this strange dusty combination of mini wheat shreds and sugar. And what you want to do with that is take it and make it into an ice cream topping. You pour all that over some vanilla ice cream, or if you're super health conscious, vanilla yogurt will do. But the mini wheat dust at the bottom of the bag is its own reward for finishing the bag.
This whole thing is rewarding.
I'm so glad you feel that way. And for the record, if you're on a road trip and you do this with the box of shredded mini wheat, every gas station will helpfully sell you a little, like quart of vanilla ice cream that you can then add the dust to. So you're fine you're covered. No matter where you are, you're covered on all the shredded mini wheat eating bases.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. This has been an incredible conversation, Lindsey. I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a lot of food for thought. So for anyone who wants to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
Oh, I love talking to people. You can certainly find me on my website at Onward Psych Services. I'm on Instagram where I do what I call practical tactical videos that are really fun, little nuggets about skills and strategies for coping with being human. You're welcome to call me. I have a phone number. I love hearing from people. My phone number is on my website, but it's also 720-362-8164. But I'd say the best way to reach me is either Instagram or through my website, contact me form at onwardpsychservices.com.
Wow. Thank you again. And
thank you.
Thank you for your time and your sharing your expertise and your humor with us. I mean, it has been awesome talking to you.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Alina. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for doing what you're doing and sharing your journey with folks.
Thank you for all our listeners for tuning into this episode. If you found value in this conversation, don't forget to share it with someone who might benefit from Lindsey's wisdom. Until next time, keep working and on rewriting those stories that no longer serve you. Thank you for listening to MindShift. This episode was made possible by pure enthusiasm and the decision to follow my dreams. You can help support future episodes by contributing on the platforms such as Buy Me a Coffee or Ko-fi, where you can find me as Alina Bartuli. Don't forget to subscribe to my social media. I hope you feel more satisfied and accomplished as you pursue a life that brings you happiness, peace, and inspiration. I'm Alina Bartuli, and I'm excited to continue this incredible journey with you. Bye-bye, until next time.